Welcome to Record, Mix and Release, a YouTube series which takes you through the process of recording a song from beginning to end in your home studio and releasing it to the world. And in this episode, we'll be recording virtual organ and piano. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I do hope you're well. Now welcome to the fourth episode in this series where we record, mix and release a song to the world from a home studio. And in this episode I'm going to be recording an organ and a piano, as well as doing a little bit of housekeeping as well. But before we get stuck into that, if you want to be notified about other episodes in this series, as well as other content from this channel where we talk about home recording, DAWs, gear reviews, plugin reviews, that kind of thing, then please do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that they notify you about other episodes. Now in this episode, we're going to be looking at things a little bit differently, because although we'll be looking at the practical aspects of recording these virtual instruments, we'll very much be discussing how they fit into the color and the dynamics of the song. A really important thing to consider as you add each instrument to your song. As well as that, at this stage we're going to be doing a little bit of tidying up so that we don't get into a muddle later on. So stay tuned for all of that, but let's get stuck in and record an organ. So the first instrument that we're going to record today is this Hammond B3 organ, but I'd like to take a look at the dynamics of the song so that you can see where this instrument fits in and how it plays a role. The song starts off with just a lone acoustic guitar, very, very laid back. Then for the first and the second verse, it adds in the vocal and nothing much more than that. Then we get our first lift when we go into the first chorus. Naturally, that happens for a chorus. But when we go back to the third verse, we just drop down slightly. Not as far as the first and the second verse, but just down from the chorus. Then we get a little lift again, a little bit of variation for the fourth verse, and then we lift, of course, again into the second chorus, which is a little bit stronger than the first chorus was. Then, a little bit unusually, we do a massive drop. We drop all the way down to just barely anything, just an organ and a vocal for a kind of a break section, which then crescendos into the third chorus, which is much louder than the first and second choruses were, and then the fourth and final chorus, which lifts again to the finale of the song. So you can see in my mind I have an idea of how the song will progress. So what role does this organ play? Well, it's first introduced in the first chorus, and it really just helps to add a little bit more to the sound, a little bit more variation, and adds another layer. Now I'm also thinking about it adding to a different frequency range. So if we just have a quick listen to it, this is where most of it lives, in this major G chord here. And you can see that that's much, much higher, or you can hear, I should say, that it's quite a bit higher than what's happening in the guitar. I think of the acoustic guitar as living more in the middle of the frequencies. So this starts to take up an area of the song which hasn't been taken up much until this point. The second thing it does is it has a different musical role. So it is actually doing the kind of stabs that the guitar does. So if I just did the stabs, it goes... Fairly simple, right? But what I'm actually going to do is have some little sort of melodic fills in there. So we're going to do something like this. So you can hear that that's something a little bit different, and it's those fills are happening in between the vocal parts. So we get a vocal line, we get a little melodic fill, and so on. It goes down quite a bit again in the third verse, but I use that kind of theme again in the fourth verse, where we do some sort of echoing back to the vocal melodically, and so on and so forth. So it's not that it's just adding a new sound, it's adding to a different frequency range, and then it's musically doing something a little bit different. And it has variation from when it comes in all the way through to the end of the song, so that we're always creating a new bit of interest for the listener, even though they may not consciously recognize that it's happening. So with all that said, let's just take a quick look at the actual instrument. This is being used in Kontakt, so I've got a Kontakt plugin there, and I'm using this library, which is from Native Instruments. It's called Vintage Organs, and I'm using this Tone Wheel Organ B3. I've adjusted the default settings just a little bit to get the sound as I like it. Now, this library is probably about 9 years old, I think 9 or 10 years old. There are some much more recent B3 libraries, which are fantastic in their design, very, very detailed, and a lot of work has gone into actually producing these kind of things these days. But even though this is old and I don't think so much work went into it, I just happen to like the sound of it. I've tried the others and they're great, perhaps for other songs, but this really felt right to me for this song. And what I like about it is we get that classic B3 sort of sound, with just a little bit of attack on the keys, but what I really like is the little bit of distortion that I'm getting on it. And that just helps to give it just a little bit of bite, which I want. The song so far is fairly, there's nothing really distorted in it or edgy in it. So this just, and I don't want it to be too much like that as a song, but this does create just a little bit of edge. So I'm going to go ahead and record this organ part. Again, I'll just show you the first few bars of it, and then I'll discuss what I'm going to be doing with the MIDI afterwards. So let's go ahead and record it. Wish me luck. So we're going into the first chorus.
I don't buy what I've been sold. Happiness is made of gold, or another one can fill your soul. I don't buy what I've been sold.
Okay, so now I've recorded the organ. I'm going to take a look at the MIDI and see if I can tidy it up in any way. So I'll switch that instrument off. I'll take off the record enabling, and then I'm just going to double click on this track to bring up the piano roll. And it's quite interesting. Right away, I noticed something in here that some of the timing is a little bit off. So I'm not the world's greatest keyboard player, but this wasn't a very particularly great part. It wasn't technically difficult to play, but it is a little bit off on some of the timing. So let's just have a quick listen to it. What I'm going to do is actually solo that organ, and I'm going to do something here in Cakewalk, which is dim soloing mode, where I can still hear the other instruments, but they're a lot quieter. I'm just going to have a listen.
I don't buy what I've been sold. Happiness is made of gold, or another one can.
So you'll notice that although visually these notes are, a fair amount off of the grid line, it still sounds okay. Now, I'm sort of a believer in if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But also, we really want to keep as much humanity as we can. If we went ahead and we quantized all of this, it would sound absolutely perfect, but most likely too perfect, and that's not something I want, particularly for this part where it plays a little bit of a melodic role in repeating back to the vocal. Now, if I did want to edit it at all, my approach is this with these types of instruments. I actually turn the snap off so that I'm not going to be snapping at all when I drag things around down here. And if I just wanted to make those a little bit tighter with the rhythm, I'll grab those 3 notes there and I'll just move them around like so. Never moving them exactly onto the grid line. And I can see here that I tend to want to be sort of pushing the rhythm here a little bit, so the notes are just a little bit ahead of the grid line all the way along. So I personally will probably leave it like that, but you could go ahead and if you wanted to be very, very particular, say grab a note like this and just drag it a little bit closer to the grid line. But I would not quantize this part. You can even see in here that there are some notes which, well, I don't think they quite belong. This was a kind of a passing note, which I think I probably hit by accident. But again, I'm going to leave it in there. So it's kind of, you've got to use this up to the discretion of your ears. If there's a note in there, which is obviously a horrible mistake, then you may want to record it again, or you may just want to go in and move notes around, delete some of them until you get it right. Now, the other thing that I would also do is go through and be listening to the velocities of the notes, because if you're not a very good keyboard player like me, often that can be a bit problematic in that you don't really hit the notes at the right sort of velocity for the feel of the music. However, For a Hammond B3 organ, it's pretty much immaterial since it wasn't a velocity sensitive instrument. You always, no matter how hard you press, get the note at the same volume. So I don't need to go through and look at the velocities for this particular instrument. I may well do with the next instrument which I'm going to record, which is the piano. So if this song were a movie, we could say that the organ played a walk-on part, but we could also say that the piano that I'm about to record would merely have an extras role. So you would probably find that when you hear the final mix, you'll think, hey Mike, where's that piano you recorded? But then if I muted it, you would think, oh, there's something missing from this song. It's that kind of role, fairly subtle. It doesn't do anything musically noticeable. It pretty much mimics what the bass guitar and the acoustic guitar are doing, and it's probably not going to be very loud in the mix. So you might ask, well, why have it there at all? And that's a really good question, because I don't really believe that things should just be there just because. But I do think that I want the second, third and fourth chorus to be much fuller than the first chorus was. So I'm using this in that kind of role to add a little bit of body to the sound. As I say, it's not particularly loud, but it adds something just in the lower to middle range, just to make the whole thing feel a bit thicker in sound. So that's the kind of role that the piano plays. Now let's just take a quick look at the piano itself. I'm using this Challen piano. Now, this piano, I think it's from Cine Samples, is an Abbey Road piano. And what I really like about it is that it's not very refined at all. I didn't want this sort of beautiful concert grand sound, even though this piano does come from Abbey Road Studios, I believe. It's got a very ordinary sound to it, the sort of thing that I used to hear in, a community hall or in the school music room when I was at high school. Not particularly awesome in itself, but that's what I like about it. I like the imperfect sound of it, the feel, well, just the feel of having a very, very regular, authentic piano sound, if you like. So I'm going to go ahead and record this piano piece. Again, I'll let you hear the first few bars, and then we'll talk about how I'll treat the MIDI afterwards. So let's go ahead and arm our track for record. And as I say, it's coming in on the second chorus. It takes a break in the middle and then is there again on the third and the fourth chorus.
Oh, oh, oh. I don't buy what I've been sold, that happiness is made of gold, or another one can fill your soul.
Okay, so having recorded that piano, I'll just shut down that again and turn the recording off and double click on that to see what we've got. And as you saw, it's a very, very simple part indeed. We can see some imperfections here, and again, I'm going to leave them in. I really don't feel like I need to tidy that up and make it musically perfect. And this is especially important with acoustic pianos, I feel, when you're hitting chords like this, where in theory they all hit on the same note, but often you'll get, if you zoom in, which I'm sure we'll get here, a kind of a staggered effect there. I mean, this is all happening in milliseconds. When you actually go ahead and quantize that, it can start to sound really strange indeed, almost taking away the piano sound from it. So I feel it's very important to leave that in there. Of course, if there was any really horrible wrong notes that were sticking out there or something that was distinctly out of time, then I would go in and correct it. And the same again, I would not generally use the snap. I'll turn the snap off, and actually for this bass note here, I'm actually going to push it ahead a little bit of the bar so that it just attacks in there a little bit.
Or another one can fill your soul.
Now, what's much more important for this piece is the velocity, and I would go through and just kind of have a listen to make sure each of those stabs are really fitting in with the song. You can see, for example, this one here gets much louder. Let's have a listen to it.
Another one can fill your soul. No, I don't buy what I...
Well, it's okay. It's nothing that I'm going to be worried about. But if I wanted, I could go in and adjust some of the velocities. Sorry, just for one note at a time, like so. You could go in, select a note, and then move its velocity down like so, or however you want to do it. So velocity does become important, and it's worth noting this because a little bit later on when we come to mixing, we're going to spend a fair amount of time on automation. And I sometimes, rather than actually automate a virtual instrument, I first of all address it from a velocity perspective. So I will sometimes go in and take a section which I think should be a little quieter and actually reduce the velocity of the notes, remembering that changing the velocity with good virtual instruments actually changes the characteristic of the sound of the instrument as well. And that's very, very true with piano, because if we take a quiet note like so, and when I play it very loudly, the tones in it are very, very different to when I'm playing it quietly. So worth keeping that in mind. You can think about sort of volume with virtual instruments in terms of velocity as well as actual volume in the mix. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some tidying up that I'd sort of like to consider at this stage. So we're at a stage in the song now where things are just getting a little bit more complex. We've already recorded 9 tracks in total, although only 4 of them are going to remain in the final song. The first 5 were all temporary instruments, guide instruments, which just help us to build the feel of the song as we're recording our main instruments. Now, I've already named them appropriately, but if you haven't, it's worth taking a look at naming at this stage. Make sure that you've got naming which means something to you and you can recognize what it was. I had a naming convention here, so anything that's temporary, I prefix it with an X to let me know I'll be deleting it later. And I've grouped all of those tracks all together at the beginning of the project so that they're not all mixed up with everything else. And then my final 4 tracks are the ones that I will keep, and again I've named them appropriately. The other thing that can start to get out of hand is your system resources, and what will happen is that you'll be playing virtual instruments, and you may be familiar with this, and you'll hit a note on your keyboard and there's a slight delay before some actual sound comes out, and that can be incredibly off-putting when you're actually playing those instruments. Now, you are limited somewhat by your system resources and the particular setup you've got, so it's going to be different for everyone, but we're just going to look at some ways that we can improve that situation for you quickly. So that sort of thing that's happening, that delay between when you hit on the key and the sound comes out, is a thing called latency, and that basically describes the length of time between when you hit a note on that keyboard, the system processes that through the virtual instrument and also plays all of the other tracks which are going on at that point, and you hearing that sound at the end. And of course, the more that's going on, the more the computer has to do, and the longer that latency can be. So the first thing you're going to do to try and improve it is by changing buffer sizes. That's one terminology. Let's have a look at it. I'll go up to Edit and then Preferences here in Cakewalk. Now I'm just going to make sure I've clicked on my driver settings tab here. Now it's going to be different, of course, if you're in a different DAW, but it's going to be in Preferences or Settings, something like that. And you're looking for your audio device settings. Now, you can see here, there's a little sort of report here from Cakewalk that I have an input latency of 16.9 milliseconds, an output latency of 13.6, and a total roundup of 30.5. So a lot of you who know something about this will be thinking, oh my goodness, that's huge. And in terms of numbers, it's sort of big-ish. But what's important to me is not the numbers, but how it feels. At the moment, with the project where it is at the moment, when I'm playing things on the keyboard, it feels quite comfortable for me. But if I did find that there was a bit of a delay, then I would look to improve that latency setting. Now I'm going to hit on this ASIO panel button here, and what this is going to do is open up the driver interface for my particular audio interface. And this is where it gets pretty tricky in terms of doing tutorials on this kind of thing, because it's going to be different for everyone depending on what audio interface you're using. But the main thing you'll be looking at is something here called the block size. Now, if it's not called the block size on your interface, you'll recognize some of the numbers here. The settings here, 512, 256, 128, 64, etc. Now, 512 is sort of fairly high, and that's why I've got a fairly large latency round trip there. So if I want to make it smaller, I'll go down to say something like 128. And that means that if I was having problems before, I will now find that if I apply that, and then I go ahead and start to play my piano, which I'm not on the piano there, so I'll scroll down and start to play the piano, that I'll get a nice immediate effect. It will feel very, very responsive. The only problem I might have is when I actually start playing my track, if I've made that number too low, then I'll get some sort of pops and clicks, or it may even have an audio drop out and stop playing altogether. So you're always playing a balancing game between getting a nice response time from that latency and actually having stability when your song is playing. Thank you so much for watching this episode in the series. In the next episode, we'll be adding some acoustic guitar parts to our song. Now, if you liked this video, then you can show your appreciation by hitting the like button. It really does help me out. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you're notified about other episodes and content from this channel. And I'll see you in the next video.